Welcome back to the channel. We are continuing the trend of providing you with information we find based on the GED exam. Based on the latest insights from the GED conference this past summer of 2024, one of the key skills on the GED Science exam is understanding experimental design, especially identifying independent and dependent variables. This skill is crucial because it tests your ability to comprehend how scientific investigations are structured and how conclusions are drawn. So let me ask you, do you know what independent and dependent variables are? Take a moment to think about it. Maybe you've encountered these terms in your science classes or while reading about experiments. If you're thinking that the independent variable is what the scientist changes or manipulates, and the dependent variable is what is measured or observed, you're absolutely correct. Understanding these variables helps you grasp the cause and effect relationships in scientific studies. Now, why do you think this skill is important? Well, being able to identify variables allows you to critically evaluate experiments and understand whether the conclusions are valid based on the data presented. Let's look at an example. Imagine this scenario. A researcher wants to test if a new fertilizer increases the growth rate of tomato plants. They apply the new fertilizer to one group of plants and use no fertilizer on another group. All plants are kept under the same conditions of light, water, and soil type. After 4 weeks, the researcher measures the height of the plants. What do you think is the independent variable in this experiment? Take a moment to consider. If you said it's the use of the new fertilizer, you're absolutely right. The independent variable is what the researcher changes intentionally. In this case, whether the plants receive the fertilizer. Now, what is the dependent variable? What is being measured? If you thought it's the height of the tomato plants, you're correct. The dependent variable is what's observed and measured in the experiment. Why is it important that all plants are kept under the same conditions of light, water, and soil type? Because these are controlled variables. They're kept constant to ensure that any differences in plant growth are due solely to the fertilizer. Now, let's look at a flawed version of this experiment. A researcher wants to prove that their new fertilizer works wonders. They apply the fertilizer to a group of tomato plants placed in a greenhouse with ample sunlight and water. Another group of plants receives no fertilizer and is placed in a shaded area with less water. After 4 weeks, the fertilized plants are taller, and the researcher claims the fertilizer is effective. What issues do you notice here? Think about it for a moment. You might notice that the researcher didn't control other variables like sunlight and water. This introduces bias into the experiment because the growth differences could be due to better light and water conditions, not necessarily the fertilizer. Now let's revise the experiment to eliminate this bias. A researcher wants to test the effectiveness of a new fertilizer on tomato plant growth. They divide the plants into 2 groups. One receives the fertilizer, and the other does not. Both groups are kept in identical conditions regarding sunlight, water, and soil type. After 4 weeks, the researcher measures and compares the heights of the plants. Do you see the difference? By controlling other variables and only changing one factor, the fertilizer, the experiment becomes more reliable and unbiased. Why is this important? On the GED Science exam, you'll be expected to analyze experiments, identify any biases or flaws, and understand how variables are managed. Here are some strategies to help you master this skill. 1. Identify the independent variable. Ask yourself, what is the one thing that's being changed intentionally? Determine the dependent variable. What is being measured or observed as a result of that change? 3. Look for controlled variables. Are other factors being kept the same to ensure a fair test? 5. Watch for bias. Is there anything in the experimental design that could unfairly influence the results? Practice with examples. The more you work through different scenarios, the better you'll become at spotting variables and potential biases. Remember, understanding experimental design not only helps you on the exam, but also enhances your critical thinking skills in everyday life. Thanks for joining me today. If you found this helpful, give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more GED prep content. Keep practicing, and I'll see you next time. As always, happy studying.